The Center for Migration Studies of New York commissioned over 20 papers on different aspects of the refugee protection system by leading scholars for a CMS conference and special collection of the Journal on Migration and Human Security entitled Rethinking the Global Refugee Protection System. In this video, George Rupp, President Emeritus of Columbia University and the International Rescue Committee, discusses his paper, Rethinking the Assumptions of Refugee Policy, Beyond Individualism to the Challenge of Inclusive Communities.
Well, the central concern of my paper is to look at the disconnect or tension, or if we want to be dramatic, contradiction between the foundation of American refugee or global refugee policy. Namely, it's founded on rescuing individuals who move across borders. And if we look at the Geneva Convention of 1951, it does mention larger entities, but the focus is on the individual. And the tension is with the current circumstances where the vast majority of displaced people in the world are displaced as a result of tensions between communities and conflicts between communities. And it seems to me that the whole refugee protection system needs to take better account of the community as well as the individual. Well, the recommendations are pretty straightforward. The first, to put it in its most dramatic form, is to reject the distinction between refugees and internally displaced people. Now, that's oversimple, and our conference here has been very successful in pointing out the risks involved in backing away from the protections that individual refugees have. So I think it really is more realistic to conceive of refugees as a subset of the population of uprooted people and work very hard to extend the protections granted to refugees to other uprooted people, and particularly in internally displaced people within countries. That would be one recommendation. A second recommendation is that we need to intervene much more massively at an earlier point in time to avoid huge displacements of populations. It's not as if we have no way of anticipating when conflicts are going to arise, and we need to do a better job of intervening at a point at which people can remain in their communities instead of being uprooted and then seeking alternative places to go. And thirdly, it seems to me important to focus attention on the ways in which we can build communities successfully, both in sending countries and in receiving countries. And in terms of receiving countries, it means if the countries of first refuge, they need to be integrated into the local economy, they need to be allowed to work, need to be allowed to get education and health care. In terms of sending countries, it's critically important to build communities so that people don't feel the need to cross borders to another place. Well, rebuilding or reconceiving refugee protection is really urgently needed because the numbers of displaced people just have overwhelmed the capacity of the existing system to deal with the issue that's before it. So I think it's crucial that we look carefully at the refugee protection system. We try to preserve the strengths that it has, in particular the protection of individuals and the respect for individual courage in fleeing circumstances of oppression. But we also have to rethink the whole process so that it can address the needs of the much larger numbers of uprooted people who never even become refugees, but are displaced within their own country. Well, I think one fact that many citizens in the developed world do not realize is that the vast majority of uprooted people are in the developing world. This really came home very intensely in this most recent Syrian crisis. There were over 5 million refugees in the neighborhood, in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. Over 5 million before any significant numbers of refugees from Syria ever reached the developed world. And yet we began to see this as a crisis only once bodies started washing up on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's really, and when that happened, many people in the developed world said, well, they should why don't the neighbors take care of some of these? Excuse me, the neighbors already had over 5 million refugees that they were caring for with very little help from the outside. So that's a fact that I think people need to appreciate more. Well, I think protecting refugees is an urgent moral imperative. These are people who are subjected to very serious harm, and they need to be rescued and brought to home. There I am really quoting the tagline of the International Rescue Committee, from harm to home. But if there's a population that embodies the challenge of delivering that service, then it's the refugee population.